Okay, let's briefly talk about Bang Si-hyuk, who is the chairman of HYBE, also known as Hitman Bang. So on July 16th, the Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, announced that it held a regular meeting and then decided to report Bang Si-hyuk and former HYBE executive to the prosecution for violating the Capital Markets Act, specifically the ban on unfair trading practices. Now, Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, is a sub-body of the Financial Services Commission, FSC, or 금융위원회, and they are responsible for enforcement and oversight related to capital markets, including investigations into unfair trading, market manipulation, and disclosure violations. Now, earlier on July 7th, the Capital Markets Investigation Deliberation Committee, which is a sub-body of the SFC, had already recommended his referral to prosecutors after deliberation. And at the time, as we have discussed on my channel, HYBE had made a full statement saying, "Hello, this is HYBE. We sincerely apologize for the concern caused by the recent reports related to our listing process. We are fully cooperating with the financial authorities and the police by providing detailed explanations and submitting relevant materials regarding the current issues being raised. Although it may take some time, we will thoroughly clarify that our IPO at the time was conducted in full compliance with the laws and regulations. Thank you." And then about how many 10 days later, SFC made an official announcement, and let me read you. So this is from their official website, fsc.go.kr. The title, Disciplinary Action on Unfair Trading During IPO Process, Resolution at the 14th Securities and Futures Commission Meeting, July 16th, 2025. So let me read you, naturally translated into English. At its 14th regular meeting held on July 16th, 2025, the Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, resolved to file a complaint with the prosecution and notify relevant parties regarding violations of Article 178 of the Financial Investment Services and Capital Markets Act, which prohibits unfair trading activities. The complaint involves the largest shareholder and former executive of Company A, which is a listed firm. So notice that they did not name the company, and they explain why at the end. And also, they say 최대 주주 및 전 임원, former executive, did not specify how many, whether it's singular or plural. I'm assuming that. Actually, I have no idea. So, but when I translate, I will assume that it's a singular, or whatever. So, the largest shareholder and former executive of HYBE, we can understand, who were suspected of deceiving existing shareholders and utilizing a specifically structured private equity fund. The individuals in question, including the largest shareholder and former executives of Company A, are accused of misleading pre-IPO shareholders during the stock acquisition process. Though Company A, HYBE, was actively preparing for an initial public offering, IPO, they allegedly led the existing shareholders to believe that the IPO would be delayed. As a result, these shareholders sold their shares to a special purpose company, SPC, established by a private equity fund linked to Company A executives. The private equity fund in question was created and funded by HYBE's executives and operated by a management firm they established. Okay. In addition, the parties entered into a shareholder agreement that included a clause granting 30% of the SPC's capital gains to HYBE's largest shareholder, aka Bang Si-hyuk. But during the 2020 IPO process, they allegedly concealed both the existence of this agreement and the connections between HYBE executives and the private equity fund. 은폐, that's a strong Korean word meaning to conceal or to hide. Now, following the IPO, the SPC sold its holdings of HYBE shares. Of course, at the time, HYBE was called Big Hit. And per the shareholder agreements, 30% of the resulting profits were paid to the largest shareholder. Meanwhile, the former executives, acting as limited partners in the general partner (GP) of the private equity fund, are suspected of obtaining substantial illicit gains in the form of performance-based compensation and other means, constituting acts of unfair trading. And then they even drew this diagram to explain what really happened. This is Chairman Bang, Bang Si-hyuk, Hitman Bang, and I guess they're talking about multiple former HYBE executives. All right, and then here's the SPC, the fund, the managing firm, IPO, and then the original shareholders who sold their shares to the new investors upon the recommendation or the suggestion made by Hitman Bang at the time, according to SFC. Okay, so they even drew this nice diagram. Now, the financial authorities will fully cooperate with the prosecution to ensure a thorough investigation into this case, which has drawn significant public attention. The SFC remains committed to ensuring the integrity of the capital markets and protecting investor trust. Going forward, the Commission will continue to closely monitor and address any attempts by controlling shareholders or others to pursue unjust personal gains. Any violations uncovered will be investigated rigorously and dealt with firmly to maintain a fair and transparent market order. And then they added this footnote. This case pertains to conduct that occurred prior to the implementation of certain enforcement mechanisms, including the administrative fine system for unfair trading, effective January 19th, 2024, and orders to suspend payments, restrict financial product trading, or limit executive appointments, effective April 23rd, 2025. And in consideration of ongoing investigations, the identities of the individuals and company involved are not being publicly disclosed at this time. All right, so we will, talk more about this at the end of this video, what this really means. Now, Bang Si-hyuk himself, according to Korean media, has not issued a personal statement on this matter. In his place, though, HYBE made a comment, and this was circulated through the Korean media, so I'm assuming it is official. HYBE has said, "It is unfortunate that the chairman's sincere explanation during the FSS investigation that he never sought personal gain in connection with the IPO was not accepted." 최대 주주가 금감원 조사에 출석해 상장을 전제로 사익을 추구한 사실이 없음을 적극적으로 소명한 점이 받아들여지지 않아 안타깝다. Yeah, because according to the Korean media, Bang Si-hyuk went to the FSS to explain himself during the investigation at the end of last month, June. Okay. We respect the authorities' decision and will do our utmost to actively cooperate with the upcoming investigation, clarify any misunderstandings, and regain the trust of the market and stakeholders. Now, observers believe that Bang Si-hyuk's decision to skip the SFC hearing may have been based on a calculation that the financial watchdog had already made up its mind. So this paragraph is from one of the articles that I had found. So yes, FSS requested or ordered that Bang Si-hyuk come to their office to explain himself. During the investigation, Chairman Bang, Hitman Bang, or Bang Si-hyuk went there. But SFC gave him another, quote-unquote, opportunity to explain himself during their hearing, right? But for that one, Bang Si-hyuk was not in attendance. And according to Korean media, observers believe that his decision to skip the SFC hearing may happen because of his calculation, or HYBE's calculation, that for some reason SFC had already made up its mind. And that's pretty interesting. With prosecution referral already on the table, it's possible that Bang Si-hyuk preferred to focus all efforts on the legal investigation instead. And when the news first broke out last week, like July 7th or 9th, that SFC is ready to refer his case to prosecution, the experts believe that, this decision will not change, even though the official regular meeting will take place on July 16th. Okay? Which is why they're saying that, probably Bang Si-hyuk calculated that SFC will not change their decision and prefer to focus all efforts on the legal investigation instead. And they say, let's see. 실제로 현재 미국에 체류 중인 방 의장은 본격적인 검찰 수사를 대비 중인 것으로 전해졌다. So, Bang Si-hyuk is reportedly preparing for the upcoming inquiry while staying in the U.S. So currently Bang Si-hyuk is staying in the U.S., probably working on music with BTS. Also, under South Korea's Capital Markets Act, fraudulent and unfair trading that results in illicit gains or avoided losses exceeding 5 billion won can be punished by life imprisonment or a minimum of 5 years in prison. If investors who bought shares before the IPO claim they were misled by Bang Si-hyuk's actions, the case could escalate into a series of civil lawsuits. This is how many of Korean articles covering this issue end their articles with saying how Bang Si-hyuk could even be subjected to life imprisonment, life sentence. And speaking of Korean media and articles and Korean media agencies, there have been a lot of provocative headlines, and we are seeing some familiar names. For example, journalist Lee Sun-myung from Sports Kyunghyang, who have made some great articles against Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE, especially notable during last year's conflict between Minijin and HYBE. And Lee Sun-myung wrote articles almost like in defense of New Jeans and Minijin, and clearly against HYBE and Bang Si-hyuk, and some very provocative headlines such as this one: will Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE become the Lee Jae-myung administration's cautionary tale? Okay, and then look how he put photo of Bang Si-hyuk and photo of the current president side by side. It is super transparent what they're trying to say, what they're trying to do with this. How about this one? Also by Lee Sun-myung. The 400 billion Korean won Bang Si-hyuk took, was it public money? Growing criticism of the national pension. Because national pension invests in HYBE, they're trying to say that Bang Si-hyuk technically stole money from the citizens of Korea. But NPS actually made money with HYBE IPO though. So, and then how about this one? 일간 Sports. Bang Si-hyuk faces criminal complaint over fraudulent trading. HYBE hit with real owner risk concerns. Okay, saying that Bang Si-hyuk is a risk factor for HYBE and HYBE investors. How about this one? New Daily Economy. Is this the fall of Bang Si-hyuk? HYBE chairman referred to prosecutors for fraudulent trading. Wow. So, but this is not really news for those who have been following how the Korean media covers Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE, right? So, at the end of the day, Bang Si-hyuk is being accused of hiding a shareholder agreement with the private equity fund that secured him 30% of the fund's IPO gains, right? The suspicion is that HYBE insiders bought pre-IPO shares under false pretenses, misleading existing investors into selling cheap, only to profit later when the company went public from SFC's perspective. Now, this particular paragraph from their press release is significant or notable. Right? It literally says, the largest shareholder and former executives of Company A, in an effort to profit by selling shares after the IPO, 이익을 얻을 목적으로 deceived existing shareholders during the pre-IPO period by making it seem as if the listing would be delayed, even though the company was actively preparing for the IPO. As a result, they induced the shareholders to sell their shares to a special purpose company, SPC, set up by a private equity fund involving HYBE's executives. Now, since this is an official press release by the SFC, not a news article or editorial, that kind of definitive language, like 이익을 얻을 목적으로, in an effort to profit by selling shares, is intentional and strategic on their part, because they're not casually speculating. They are formally stating the basis of their criminal referral to the prosecution. And so even before conviction, because the PR press release reflects what the agency believes has been sufficiently evidence for referral, not what a court has yet decided. They're framing it as their former position based on their investigation, which is why the language is pretty strong. Now, here's what I think. So, to secure a conviction for fraudulent trading under Korean markets law, or most financial regulations globally, prosecutors must typically prove like three elements. First, Bang Si-hyuk had a clear personal financial motive, for example, like direct benefit from the transaction. And two, that there was coordinated action, like collusion with the private equity fund. And three, that investors were deliberately misled. Original investors were deliberately misled in a way that induced them to sell at a disadvantage. Okay? But here's the thing. None of these are simple to prove in court. And if even one of these pillars is shaky, the case becomes hard to win criminally. Like, if the benefit that Bang Si-hyuk received was indirect or delayed or theoretically justifiable, like as part of a standard shareholder agreement, prosecutors would need more than just circumstantial evidence to prove criminal intent. Especially in capital market cases, like benefit doesn't equal fraud unless there's deception or non-disclosure with intent to profit unjustly. And unless there's a paper trail or direct communication showing Bang Si-hyuk coordinated with the private equity fund to manipulate the listing process or market expectations, collusion remains speculative. The fact that HYBE insiders had ties to the fund is kind of suspicious. I also kind of think that, especially as a shareholder's perspective, because I'm a shareholder in HYBE, but not in itself collusive. And it would be also difficult to prove that Bang Si-hyuk or HYBE explicitly told pre-IPO investors falsehood like we're not going public just to buy their shares cheap. Because in most startup or private equity ecosystems, expectations around IPO timing are fluid and non-binding, and sophisticated investors would of course know that. And the idea that investors were naive enough to fully believe that a company wasn't listing, especially if it was already preparing for IPO, could weaken the victim narrative in court. So all of this adds up to a conclusion that a criminal conviction is not guaranteed, even if the optics are bad and the public is outraged. Because right now, because of the fact that there are so many articles coming out every day against HYBE and Bang Si-hyuk, people are like, basically have already made a conclusion that Bang Si-hyuk is a criminal, basically. But prosecutors must prove intent and manipulation beyond a reasonable doubt. And as we have seen in other like corporate scandals, that's often a high bar, a bar that's pretty high. But at this current stage, rumors of this, familiar story. The Korean media, like rumors of chart manipulation or media control spread unchecked. Rumors against HYBE, and Bang Si-hyuk was portrayed as the mastermind behind it all. And time and again, the media declared guilt before any process of justice had begun. And it sounds very familiar. And I gotta say, HYBE isn't perfect, but in the Korean media landscape, it has become symbolic of capitalistic ambition, HYBE Bang Si-hyuk, of cultural dominance, of corporate scale that makes people uneasy. And that's why Bang Si-hyuk is such an easy target, I believe. He isn't just the head of a label. He's seen as an architect of the system. And when you are a symbol, people don't argue the details. They just want a reckoning, right? And Bang Si-hyuk may be guilty. Who knows? We'll have to see. So he may be guilty or not. But due process hasn't played out yet. That hasn't stopped certain media outlets from pushing like angles like Bang Si-hyuk's 400 billion won came from the people. He'll be made an example by the government. The article is made by Lee Sun-myung, and HYBE's owner risk has materialized. Or like this, is this the fall of Bang Si-hyuk? And when media outlets jump straight to moral outrage without explaining legal nuance, that's not journalism, it's agenda setting. And I feel like even if the prosecution, clears Bang Si-hyuk or the court finds him not guilty, there's a strong chance that some people, especially anti-fans, and certain media outlets will never accept it at face value. They might just say that HYBE used their influence, or Bang Si-hyuk bought his way out, or that there's no justice when it comes to the rich. In other words, the narrative has already hardened, and for a lot of people, the verdict won't even matter. They have already decided that he's guilty, and anything short of punishment will be framed as corruption, not innocence. And this is the trap of becoming a public symbol like Bang Si-hyuk. Once someone is cast as the villain, especially in a high-profile industry like Kpop, it's incredibly difficult to reverse public perception, no matter what the facts say. And I have a feeling that HYBE probably understands that the Korean public opinion is highly reactive, and often it's shaped by dramatic headlines rather than facts. Especially after last year's Minijin, the Minijin case. Remember after Minijin's press conference, the domestic sentiment quickly shifted. When the media builds a one-sided narrative, and HYBE must have realized that also. In contrast, what I realized last year was that international audiences, who don't rely on Korean media, tended to be more neutral or cautious. I did a lot of research into public opinions, but international audiences tend to be cautious about what everything Minijin said during her press conference, and not easily swayed. And I have realized this, especially last weekend. So there's this super smart, intelligent Korean lawyer that I'm teaching English to. And we had a conversation about this topic. We talk about a lot of different stuff, including politics, economy, investments, or international events. And we talked about this, And even the lawyer, the smart lawyer that I'm teaching English to, wasn't fully aware of what's been happening. Like someone trained to analyze evidence didn't know the full picture of this case, Bang Si-hyuk and HYBE, because he only read headlines. Then the question is, what about the general public? If a lawyer is also, subjected to these manipulated headlines, the general public, they have no chance at, fully grasping the full picture. So that's kind of unfortunate. And I wonder what HYBE and their teams will do about that, about domestic public opinions. Maybe they have decided that the Korean GP doesn't matter anymore. Who knows? But it is super unfortunate because the media is not on their side. Speaking of which, let's briefly touch upon what I talked about in the Korean video that I made over the weekend. Okay, I basically laid out the whole case, summarized in a plain language, because the sentiment is really divided. On the one hand, you have people who clearly believe that Bang Si-hyuk is the criminal. And on the other hand, you have people who believe that he is entirely innocent. So I made some key points. So first of all, point number one, Korean media is framing allegations as facts. Like I said, Korean media is treating fraudulent, unfair trading as if it's already been proven. When in reality, Bang Si-hyuk has only been referred to the prosecution. Headlines that like Bang Si-hyuk pocketed 400 billion won or HYBE stock collapsed because of Bang are building this public verdict before legal due process. Now, the SFC cited Article 178 of the Capital Markets Act, which is a broad provision meant to capture ambiguous or emerging forms of misconduct, but its applicability is still up for debate. So the takeaway is that the language used in press and video content strongly reflects video content like this one, putting the images of Bang Si-hyuk and the current president side by side. It strongly reflects confirmation bias and result-oriented framing, ignoring legal uncertainty. Secondly, legal complexity is being oversimplified. Now, the key claim is that Bang Si-hyuk misled early investors by downplaying IPO plans in 2019, while secretly preparing the listing and signing an earn-out deal with the PEF tied to HYBE insiders. But, like I said, IPOs are highly uncertain and not guaranteed, and the agreement involved risk sharing. Bang Si-hyuk would have received nothing had the IPO failed. And the earn-out deal was between Bang Si-hyuk personally and the PEF, not with HYBE itself. And major law firms and the IPO underwriter reviewed the structure at the time. So, calling it market manipulation or fraud may not be legally sound. So the allegations depend heavily on proving intentional deception and market price distortion, which remain unproven and may not meet the legal threshold. What about the stock price? I feel like stock price reactions are also being misinterpreted. The media suggests that Bang Si-hyuk's actions triggered retail investor or losses after IPO. But post-IPO price drops are common in Korean markets. Okay, like for example, Kakao Pay and Kakao Bank plummeted, and they still haven't recovered the stock price yet. Okay, also the PF share sales accounted for only 1.7% of daily trading volume on IPO day. And pre-IPO investors had access to public filings that disclosed the lack of lockup on those shares. So, like blaming HYBE stock volatility entirely on Bang Si-hyuk's personal contract is kind of post hoc reasoning, not supported by data. Also, what about the political timing and orchestration? Like this case from 4 years ago has resurfaced just as the Lee Jae-myung administration is pushing capital markets reform. And the media is tying Bang Si-hyuk's case to the one strike out policy, the so-called one strike out policy, saying that if you manipulate your stock price, you're out of the stock market and you're gone. That's basically what Lee Jae-myung, as president, has said. Now the narrative, paints Bang Si-hyuk as a symbolic example to boost the administration's anti-corruption stance. But the thing is, the so-called on-strike out policy cannot be applied retroactively. And also, the evidence suggests that the journalists leading this story were also closely involved in the Minigen conflict. How the 한국경제, the Korean daily economic journalist, have written an article that disclosed the original copy of the investor agreement made between Minigen and HYBE, which they would not have been able to have access to unless Minigen herself gave the copy to them. So this raises the possibility of internal leaks and orchestrated media timing. So the resurgence of this case appears kind of strategically aligned with political messaging and potentially turning a private illegal issue into a public morality play. And now, I did point out from the investor's perspective that there might be some systematic loopholes that could be the issue, not criminal intention, malice. So the PEF earnout deal, technically, how should I say? So one could use such PEF earnout deal to technically exploit a gray zone. For example, by using a third-party fund, Bang Si-hyuk may have bypassed the lockup rules meant to prevent early profit taking by insiders. Okay, we don't know about his intention, and yes, he also had to shoulder risk. Right, it wasn't clear whether he was able to make money. The IPO itself wasn't clear, and the fact that BTS became even larger than they were before, that itself wasn't clear. Nobody knew. It's all about hindsight bias, which I also referred to. Yeah, there we go. Hindsight bias. From our perspective today, it was so obvious that Big Hit or HYBE IPO'd and BTS became one of the biggest groups in the world. But at the time, 2019, it wasn't clear. Everything was uncertain. Now, back to the discussion of the PEF deal. The structure was legal, but could set a dangerous precedent for other firms to game the system. Think about the rug pull of the crypto market. The owner of a company or a project makes their company go public and then sell all their shares to the general investor and then hit the road. And that shouldn't happen. And even if Bang Si-hyuk did not have such ill intention, company owners, after learning about what he did, this method, could try to game the system through this method, which is why some retail investors in Korea, even though they don't know about this case clearly, get outraged by these headlines. because they believe that Bang Si-hyuk is a clear example of someone trying to game the system. So that loophole should be addressed, I personally believe, because it reveals institutional vulnerabilities. And the solution may lie in police policy reform, not prosecution though. And the Korean authorities themselves have recognized this and said that this is like a loophole, and this is something that we should have been more careful about, even though they decided not to punish HYBE, and this was something we had already discussed last year. Okay, but then of course this case resurfaced a few months later, also thanks to 한국경제, Korean Economic Daily. Now lastly, let's talk about HYBE stock price. Okay, again, so HYBE stock isn't falling just because of the Bang Si-hyuk controversy, although the media tried to make it seem like, it has more to do with the broader market dynamics, like sector rotation. For example, K-pop companies have been performing really well until recently. Why? Because remember how a lot of companies and stocks have fallen earlier this year because of the US tariff issues? Well, entertainment companies, K-pop companies are kind of exempt from tariffs, which is why their stock price rose significantly, while other companies were doing poorly. Of course, recently though, the current administration and the president are really working hard on elevating stock prices of Korean companies. So a lot of Korean stocks have been doing well, while for K-pop companies stocks, they're kind of stagnant. So there is some sort of sector rotation going on. Now, I think the biggest factor for the poor performance of HYBE stock price has more to do with BTS comeback and their earnings, Q2 earnings. According to analysts, HYBE's Q2 performance will be kind of worse than analysts' expectations because of several reasons. One, there were a lot of costs that were generated because of newly debuted groups or groups that are about to debut and major events and projects. Okay, but I think the one factor that investors pay close attention to is BTS comeback, right? It has delayed, quote unquote delayed, to next spring, whereas most analysts believe that they will have a comeback by the end of this year, followed by the world tour. Okay, so that has caused a gap, a time gap or delays in their expectations. So, which is why the stock price kind of, I guess investors were kind of disappointed by that. Although I personally am super glad that BTS is taking time to write new music and new projects, and to prepare for the world tour. Okay, but this has more to do with delayed gratification, so to say, I believe. And I think, institutional investors are likely aware of the legal nuances and are not reacting in the same way the general public or retail investors are, because ordinary investors, retail investors, get swayed by emotions and media narratives, right? They panic, they react, and they sell. But the people who actually move the market, the institutional investors, hedge funds, and analysts, they look deeper. And I think they don't base $1 million decisions on rumors. They'll be looking at legal risk, long-term fundamentals, management strategy, and how insulated BTS brand power is from all of this. So the question is HYBE doomed just because domestic sentiment is against them? No. But it could hurt the brand in the short term. Especially when the owner, quote unquote, owner risk gets repeatedly amplified by the Korean media. So yeah, HYBE has to play a long game now, I feel like. And cooperating with the legal process and rebuilding narrative control slowly and globally. Because clearly, like I said over and over again, the local media environment in Korea isn't on their side. So let's see how this turns out. Okay? Let's see how this turns out. Oh yeah, this is also the image that I included in my Korean video. This artwork, media manipulation, where the victim becomes the aggressor and the aggressor becomes framed as a victim. Yeah, the whole thing kind of reminded me of this image. All right, with this, I'll wrap it up. If you have information or opinions that you want to add to the conversation, feel free to do so by leaving comments. But when you do so, let's stay positive, respectful, and classy. Thank you. Peace and love. Bye-bye.